Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Jakarta Tech Talk. My name is Serena, and joining us today is Reza, who will be presenting on the topic of what comes after Jakarta EE 11. If you have any questions for Reza as we move through today's presentation, please feel free to put them into chat or use the Ask a Questions tab. Without any further delay, Reza, over to you.
Hi there. So first of all, thank you everyone for bearing with us. It's on unforeseen circumstances, but we needed to reschedule to today's. I hope we picked up a few people, at least numerically, from the registrations. It looks like we have. I hope we haven't lost a bunch of people. This is a very important talk, and there's a reason why I'm presenting this. It's not sort of like whatever yet another talk kind of deal. So I really appreciate your interest and your time. I hope it's going to be worth your while. We also have a little bit of bandwidth. This is one of the reasons why I sort of like this Jakarta Tech Talks format more than the traditional conference format, because I believe there's a little bit of space to be interactive. So we can go ahead and do that. So in that spirit, there's not going to be like a formal Q&A kind of thing. I'm not going to be pacing myself too much. I do respect your time. I know a lot of people have blocked specifically the hour. I will try to stay within the bounds of that hour, but I won't be like super trying to hurry up or anything. I don't think there's really a need for that. Similarly, there's not going to be sort of a Q&A at the end or something like that. If you have a question, just ask it. I have my Q&As, the chat screen here. That's the easiest thing for me to look at, and I can just periodically look at that and answer your questions sort of interactively. The thing is, I don't, for some reason, it's not really showing, it's not clear to me that you can see my screen. If you can just give me a quick holler and just let me know that you can see me and the screen, this is the best time to do that because I'm not really actually sharing anything quite important just yet. So that's all good. And, we use this platform for our jug. It has a lot of glitches. If you have any kind of problems, let us know. We'll figure out what to do here. So on the screen here, you have my contact information. I will be sharing another URL later on towards the end of the presentation or maybe afterward about my other contact information. Do feel free to reach out to me. I think in practice, in reality, this particular talk, especially without further follow up with somebody, maybe myself, it's going to be difficult for you to really probably do anything in practice, right? So you're probably going to need a little bit more guidance if you decide to do something about the content of this talk. So yeah, contact part is going to be very, very important. I've also shared, I believe I've shared the deck, this deck already. It is a public deck. It's out there on Speaker Deck. You can take a look at it anytime. You can reach me. I can give you a the PowerPoint source copy if you want. That's also not a problem whatsoever. And also, much more importantly, this particular talk is actually more or less a delivery, like a Cliff's Notes, if you're aware of that, as a Cliff's Notes version of the Ambassador's Jakarta E12 guide, which is actually out there as a happy sort of coincidence. When I was originally going to present this talk, we didn't really quite finalize it yet, but it is final now, and it is out there. So I've also shared that link, and I'm going to share that link with you after the fact as well. So, okay, with all that preamble, what is this talk about? Basically, I think many of you know, and we'll talk about this in a little bit of detail. Parts of Jakarta E11 is out. It's going to be out probably entirely in, my guess would be another few weeks. Okay, so that's with Jakarta E11 sort of under our belt. Now is the time as a community to think about what comes out, what is after Jakarta E 11, and certainly we're not in a void. Right? There's a relative clarity on what could be in, let's say, in Jakarta E12, and this is a little bit about what this talk is about. One of the unique things about this community that I hope I'm very proud of, and I hope you also see the youth and the value in, is that it is really community driven. There is no sort of central authority that determines, okay, this is what Jakarta 11 looks like or Jakarta 12 looks like. It is really a vendor collaboration and a collaboration with the community as well that helps determine these things. So that is, in fact, the point of this talk, and this talk basically is an attempt to realize that ideal, if you will, for all of us to sort of get together and help define, what the scope and what the reality of what is next for this technology ought to be. So let's move. Without further ado, let me move forward. I hope this is familiar content to everyone, but just in case we have some newcomers here, I'm going to just briefly go over the slide. Maybe for some of you, this is useful to recap. So what is Jakarta EE? Jakarta EE is basically the next rendition of the technology that used to be Java, called Java EE. It used to be called J2EE before that. A few years ago, it moved from the JCP. The JCP is where Java used to be defined, and in fact, Java SE and the Java language is still defined in the JCP. But this is basically Java EE moving to the Eclipse Foundation and hopefully living in a more vendor neutral and a far more open format. That was in fact the whole point of the move. So we still have open governance, and by the way, I happen to be part of that governance. So Microsoft is a enterprise member and actually an elected representative both in the steering and marketing committees, and actually we're committers in the Jakarta platform as well. So we're very much part of the governance for sure. It is entirely open source. There's no closed source parts of Jakarta EE. There used to be some parts of Java EE that was not actually open source. Open compatibility testing. This is a very important chain difference as well. The TCK regime in Java EE was not actually open. It was relatively controlled by Sun and Oracle. It is not anymore. It is really a much more open format. That's yet another difference. But there's some important things that remain the same and actually have been improved. These are things like there's still a well-defined specification process. It's not like a wild west. There's a clear IP flow of IP. That's very important in practice when you're going to either create or consume this technology. It allows for truly vendor neutral open collaboration, where really it is truly a level playing field, and all of those kind of characteristics that are important for vendor neutrality and openness. Also important is that so far we have not lost any of the key stakeholders from Java EE to Jakarta EE. So a lot of the folks that are stakeholders still remain stakeholders in one way or the other. Now, there's some challenges around that. Maybe there'll be scope to talk about that, maybe not, but at least in name, we've not lost any of the key stakeholders. So Oracle, IBM, Payara, Tommy Tribe, Red Hat, they all remain in stakeholders of technology in one way or the other. In fact, it has broadened somewhat, right? So there's some new players that are in Jakarta EE that didn't used to be in Jakarta EE. So some examples of this would be, in fact, be Microsoft. Things like Alibaba, which is very good to see, and some people that were there for some time, but still it's good to see them sort of formally join Jakarta as a community. Things like Soul Java, London Java community, some startup activities, things like Omnifish. So really a pretty vibrant ecosystem. If you take a step back and really look at it from a neutral perspective, it is a vendor neutral and relatively lively ecosystem with many different types of players that have a hand in this technology. Uh, Finally, the whole point, actually, again, going back to the crux of this particular talk that we're talking about today, one of the key reasons why we all, and believe it or not, this is a long journey. It was not a single initiative or sort of single driver that suddenly caused Java EE to move into Jakarta EE all of a sudden. This has been in the making for some time. So one of the key reasons we all wanted to do this is part of it is the vendor neutrality, but the other actually is sincere and active community participation. Now, it doesn't need to be very sort of crazy involved participation either, but meaningful participation from actual end users is actually one of the things that we all wanted to accomplish in the move. And I'm not certain that that has actually happened. In fact, one of the things I'll tell you is this is an honest sort of talk, and one of the things that actually concerned me is that if I look back in the Java EE days, we actually had in net better quantity and quality of community participation. In fact, I myself started as an individual contributor. There was many, I could name dozens of people like that. There was Adam, Antonio, George, Juno, Keto Man. There's just so many people that were just community people. They're not vendors, and they provided uh, qualitative, good quality feedback into specifications. And the idea, the hope was to improve that. I don't know if that has really happened. So that is also part of the reality that I want to help deliver in this talk, and maybe help improve in the end, is to both have better quantity and quality of participation from the community as well. So, okay, the other thing, again, hopefully, I'm preaching mostly to the choir for this particular talk, but yet another thing that bears repeating and bears understanding is that there's a lot of people that really sort of underestimate what the importance of this technology is, right? So they're using Spring or Quarkus or Microprofile or some other thing, and they think, oh, Jakarta, this old thing that I don't need to care about. In reality, this is really false for two reasons, right? And maybe this is something that we as a community need to have a better understanding of, and sort of better engagement in communicating why this is really not the case. So first and foremost, there actually is a lot of people just using plain old school Jakarta runtimes, and if you will, new school Jakarta runtimes. And they're quite sizable. And I know this firsthand in my day job on Azure. The reality of it is, as high as about a third of workloads out there and developers out there that don't necessarily aren't necessarily very active in places like Reddit or Twitter or what have you, actually do continue to use this technology. So they are in fact running these runtimes like Wildfly, Pyara, Glassware, JBoss AP, WebSphere, WebLogic, so on. And in fact, I'll give you another visualization. I help actually maintain the Jakarta starter. And believe it or not, every month we have in the order of thousands of people that are using the Jakarta starter to start new projects, or at least to try to spin up Jakarta projects. So all of these are sort of lost in the muddle when you look at sort of conferences or social media, and it looks like, oh, this thing, nobody uses it. And it's really not the case, right? So, and the other aspect of this is that in reality, even if you're not talking about the platform or implementations of Jakarta EE, the reality is that the technology, the specs, the underlying specs are used quite heavily, right? So whether you're using Tomcat or Hibernate or ActiveMQ, Jetty, CFX, Jersey, REST-easy, Quarkus, Microsoft Spring Boot, all of these things are actually pretty heavily dependent on one or more Jakarta technology. So this is yet another reason why this technology is important. And without this technology, this is the technology actually that creates a lot of vendor neutrality in this space, right? It has that community vibe to it, and without it, it really you would be winding up with isolated islands of vendors that don't really collaborate with each other too much, and they're just sort of just competing with each other, and that's about it. Now, one place where all of these realities actually does surface is the annual Jakarta Developer Survey that the Access Foundation some years ago decided to launch, and I think it's a really good initiative because it provides that perspective, right? All of these things actually show up and surface in that survey. So it's worth taking a look at. I have a link to it in this slide if you haven't looked at it. Now, another bit of history, again, won't talk about it too much, we'll just breeze over it real quick, is the fact that this is an old technology. It's one of the oldest technologies out there. It is really remarkable that it's been around for so long and still remains active and remains relevant. I myself, I was a user back in the early 1.4 days. I began to get involved in the spec itself sort of the tail end of Java EE5. There's actually many parts of the spec that I actually myself either authored or helped author. Right? So I personally have a long-standing sort of engagement with this technology, and it seems like even a lifetime. But the main thing I'm trying to get at is this is a technology that's been around. There's a reason why it is so important. There's a reason why it is so important. It remains all those reasons remain true, and also now we shouldn't question whether the move to the foundation or whether Jakarta EE as a concept has worked or not, right? So yes, we needed to do a lot more work to make sure that it remains vibrant and increases its strength to, frankly, where it really belongs in the Java space. But at this point, it's fairly clear that this is working, right? So all of the basic foundational pieces are there. So we've had a few releases now: Jakarta E8, 9, 9.1, 10, now almost 11, and now we're really not just within this talk, but in the platform spec or across the people that are involved in this thought process, they are also beginning to think about what is next, right? So at this point, we shouldn't question this anymore. Really, in my opinion, we should set aside all of the doubts. We should set aside questions and really refocus and figure out how do we make this thing really as successful as it deserves to be. So the other thing I'll point out is the other thing that sometimes we lose sight of, and certainly the ecosystem at large also loses sight of, is the fact that it's not just about the specs, right? The specs are the most important vehicle for this technology to remain relevant, and it remains relevant if you look at an objective look at it, like from the outside, that it's by itself has a footprint, right? But even aside from that, there are things that either feed into it or feed outward from these specs. So if things like Helidon, things like Quarkus, microfile Helidon, Hibernate, whatever you look at, these technologies are either heavily influenced by Jakarta E or heavily influence Jakarta in some way or the other. So when you look at the broader ecosystem, really it's a very, very interconnected space, and it is very lively, and it is frankly much more lively than anything else, almost anything else that you'll see out there. Maybe you can argue Python is a bit more lively these days because they're doing the AI stuff and so on. But historically, when you look at it, this is actually a very vibrant space, right? There's a lot going on at any given point in time. And Jakarta E actually is a foundational part of that in one way or the other. Yeah, always has been. So now let's move into the crux of this talk. And as I mentioned, this talk is actually more or less really just a Cliff Notes version delivery of what is the Jakarta E Ambassador's Contribution Guide. And in fact, we created this guide some time ago. This is at least the third cycle of this contributor guide. And let me explain to you what the original motivation was, and to some extent still is. So we initially created this contributor guide in the Jakarta E8 timeframe, and the reason we did this, and we did this in back in the Java E Guardians days, believe it or not, and we weren't even Jakarta E ambassadors quite yet back then. Now, of course, we're called the Jakarta E ambassadors, but the reason we created this contributor guide is actually the worry that we had a lot of forward-looking discussions in the community in the Java EE days, right? Going back many years. And what we didn't want to have happen is the forward looking thinking that existed there suddenly disappears when we move into the Eclipse Foundation and move into sort of the Jakarta EE realm of things. And this was the reason why we put together this contributor guide, is to sort of serve as the archive backlog of the things that we should still address from a community standpoint that we all know about as known gaps and known things that we should try and address. So we now have, and this is a collaborative process, we do this as a community and the ambassadors. And now we have the latest rendition of that, namely that we have now just published in the Jakarta E Ambassador site, the guide to contributing to Jakarta E12. And in fact, everything that I'll talk about here is actually documented in the document as well. So you can use that document as a reference point. And I'll also tell you, believe it or not, the ambassadors remain a very important part of this overall equation. If you're not there in the community, in our community, and haven't looked at it, I recommend you do so. Right? I think our presence and our activities has a net important impact that's not necessarily immediately understood at the surface, right? But do take a look at that if you haven't already. Okay, so as you know, Jakarta E10 and Jakarta E11 were delivered some time ago, and so we had the ambassador's guide out when each of these things were created some time ago, right? Just like right now, we don't even haven't even necessarily really begun the Jakarta E12 work, but we already have the contributor guide for Jakarta E12. And so what you can do is for each of these releases, you can actually take a look at how this release sort of performed when you use the contributor guide, the backlog, the archived backlog that we have in the ambassadors, and take a sort of evaluate what is happening at a broader level with each of these Jakarta releases. So you can take a look at this. So that's what the color coding is about. The things in green are things that actually were delivered in that particular release. In this case, let's say Jakarta E10. You can see that there's some things that were sort of in the works but were not delivered that are again in the contributor guide, and then there's some things that remain gaps. So let's take a look at 10, for example. Asynchronous was delivered, I think delivered well in Jakarta Concurrency. There was some alignment with CDI in Jakarta Batch. Completion stage from Java SE concurrency made it into Jakarta EE concurrency. There was a Bootstrap API for REST. That was a long-standing thing that we wanted to see. OpenID Connect happened in Jakarta Security. Things like managed executor definition happened. There was a little bit more alignment with like underlying SQL and JPQL. That was good to see. Multi-part farm data, the creation of a Jakarta EE specification that deliberately targets the rather the microservices space or small runtime space. That happened. A bunch of things that we wanted to see deprecated for a while. Principal one of those being EJB. Some of that happened. You know, we believe actually that there's a lot of other things that can be deprecated out of the platform to make it more modern and more lightweight, and some of those happened in Jakarta 810 as well. What didn't really happen is the net new specifications. We wanted to see a few of those, but you can see they're all sort of in flight. In some, they're in progress in one way or the other. You can take a look at Jakarta 11 in a solar context, right? So again, we sort of had some delivery of at schedule in Jakarta concurrency. I don't think it's very good. I think it can be improved. That's why I would say we would consider it on the way, sort of. Roles allowed hasn't made it in security. We would like to see, there was no real work in getting the rest of the EJB stuff out of EJB, things like max concurrency, lock annotation, an alternative for message-driven means those remain gaps. There was some progress around, again, sort of very slow-going alignment with Jakarta REST and CDI. It was really good to see that you could use Entity Manager in a CDI-friendly way now in JPA. That was a long-standing thing that was actually delivered in Jakarta 11. There still remains some gaps with regards to concurrency and CDI alignment. That's in flight. We see signs that it's being discussed. There was Java SE alignment. That's actually very important. And believe it or not, Java EE and Jakarta EE actually is one of the primary delivery vehicles for taking Java SE features and making them real. So in this case, the two examples would be records, right? So records made it successfully into at least JPA and CDI and a few other important specifications. Didn't make it into one very important area, and that's JSON. Virtual threads, we believe, more or less have made it into the alignment. Now, there's other bits of alignment that needs to happen, namely the runtimes themselves, actually catching up with the way, with the notion of virtual threads as opposed to physical threads. No Bootstrap API for messaging yet. Messaging actually has been one of those things that was a very active specification at one point. Was one of the most important specifications, but then sort of became dormant. So as a result, there's actually a long backlog of things that we could potentially see out of Jakarta messaging. The TCKs has been a pain point for a long time. Believe it or not, the TCK was the thing that was actually closed source in Java EE. As a result, it wasn't evolved very much. So it's been a long journey of actually modernizing these TCKs and making more of them stand alone. And this is actually the reason why Jakarta 11 was was delayed is the modernization of this TCK. It's important work. It's hard to understand the importance of that work if you're not a vendor. Without this work, it's frankly it's really difficult to do anything else. It's sort of the underlying backbone of a lot of the specifications. So it's too bad that it caused a delay in the delivery of Jakarta 11, but I think it's for a good cause overall. Similarly, for closing standardization gaps, it's good to see that Jakarta Security actually standardized the in-memory data store. That's something else that was talked about, at least as far back as the Java E7 timeframe. There's some gaps that still remain. JWT isn't really properly addressed in the Jakarta specification and some other things that I'll talk about in a moment. Again, some sort of old craft. It was really good to see it was deprecated. Things like SOAP and XML and Corba and this notion of managed beans that never actually took off and was sort of an odd addition to begin with. All of that stuff is gone. The security manager dependency, we need to remove this in order to move forward with the adoption of new versions of Java. It's good to see some work was done there. And again, the long-standing wish of finally just replacing EJB and hopefully someday deprecating it. Again, we made some incremental progress toward that, but not entirely. Very good to see that there was actually a new spec introduced, and yet again, this is the spec that was in the making and in discussion and had sort of a known gap. Again, going back as far as Java E7, perhaps Java E8. So it was good to see that finally made it into Jakarta 11. Of course, there's a number of other things. Configuration is another long-standing one. Believe it or not, we've been talking about modernizing configuration since Java E6, right? So very old-standing need that needs to be addressed in Jakarta EE. And of course, these other ones, NoSQL, MVC, gRPC. I'll talk about a little bit of each of those in turn as well. So actually, when you take a look at this, it's relatively easy to deduce what is the logical candidates for Jakarta 12. It's simply the stuff that is in the known backlog, a few new additions, and then basically subtracting the stuff that was delivered, right? So then you can very easily arrive at a roadmap or at least sort of a visualization. What are the possibilities, logical possibilities for Jakarta 12 that we've known about for a while? So these are again things like schedule, lockmax, concurrency, master listener. I'll talk about all of these things in a moment. Roles allowed in security, better CDI support in REST, better CDI support in concurrency. Again, those Java SE alignment pieces that we talked about, and I'll show you concrete examples of these so you will understand this better if you're sort of new to it. Some important standardization gaps. I think probably the most important one is going to be support for HTTP3. I really do hope that happens in the Jakarta E12 timeframe. That's what's going to make, frankly, the technology Jakarta E12 relevant for everyone, unquestionably, including the Spring folks and everybody else. If we add the HTTP3 support in Servlet and perhaps even in JAX-RS. Talked about the rest of these. I'll give you examples of what these things are in a moment. Again, the known list of deprecations and removals. One of the key ones that we can identify, that hopefully is a very easy thing to just begin removing, if not outright remove in Jakarta 12, is the application client container. It's again one of those odd bits of things that were added actually relatively recently speaking in terms of Java EE history in Java E6, but again, it's like one of those just like management. It's one of those odd things that some people use, but most people don't, and we have it in the platform mostly to serve a very even older technology, namely EJB remoting, pretty much. And of course, the bits of new specifications that we can also talk about. Okay, so that's a high-level overview of things. Let's. I think we're making good progress in terms of time. Again, just as a reminder, if you have any questions or concerns or what have you, or anything you want to talk in more detail about, of course, we can take it offline. But we can also post it in the chat. I am paying attention to the chat. I don't really see anything coming out of the chat as of yet. So let's now sort of shift focus a little bit. We talked at a high level about what sort of the possibilities, logical possibilities for Jakarta 12 might be. Now let's talk about some of the specifics, right? So This is sort of, in my mind, in order of importance of the things that really has been long pending and really should be done sooner rather than later. So we'll start with Jakarta Concurrency. So one of the things that would be very helpful towards the goal of modernizing the platform and modernizing how we use the key services is taking the things that are in EJB, like at schedule and at lock, and making them more generally available to any CDI bean. Adding max concurrency is one more of these. So under the hood, there actually EJB does concurrency control, and it actually does effectively do bandwidth throttling. Yet again, it's a very important foundational concept and still very relevant, and hence it actually deserves a more generic space. So using maybe creating it as a built-in CDI interceptor in the platform and publishing it through Jakarta Concurrency. CDI context propagation, another pain point that if you heavily ever used into this space of using managed threads, you'll suddenly figure out that the CDI scopes are actually not propagated properly from one managed thread to the other when you actually try to create managed threads in Jakarta EE. So again, sort of a long-standing known pain point that could potentially be addressed as well. So let's take a quick look at some quick examples. This is not particularly novel, actually. You can do this in EJB today, no problem. The only novel part of it here is that you ought to be able to do pretty much exactly the same thing just as easily in CDI. So I hope this is going to happen. I've given feedback in the concurrency spec already, to help realize something that looks like this. Same thing for lock, right? Again, it's like hidden in the balls of the EJB spec singletons, very important bit of functionality. If you sort of look beyond EJB for a moment, any kind of application scope bean, it's a very common use case where you want to do a little bit of concurrency control. And you don't need to necessarily do those concurrency controls yourself. You can do it in a very EJB fashion by just having reuse of this lock annotation that already exists. It's known semantics, but making it available in for all CDI beans, just like in this code example. Jakarta messaging again used to be such an important part of the platform. People consider this probably just as important as we consider JPA today at one point in time. This is the thing that defined messaging in Java, JMS or Jakarta messaging, and yet it's been dormant basically since Java EE8. As a result, there's so many things that actually could be done in the spec to both address known gaps as well as potentially, frankly, revitalize the entirety of the messaging space in Java. So one of the key ones is, I'll show you a good example of this so you'll see this for yourself, is taking EJB message event beans and making it more generically available and more modern through Jakarta messaging. Yet another one is that a lot of the JMS messaging paradigms made sense when it was standardized many years ago. It actually, a lot of it doesn't either is like sort of feature bloat at this point because you don't really need it anymore. It's proven to be not as useful, or just sort of overly restrictive, right? So this is a good reason for us to consider an EJB light profile. Sorry, rather a Jaka messaging light profile that fits more of the sort of use cases that things like Kafka, for example, have. They actually support less of the semantic features compared to JMS. So that's something we could think about. Yet another pain point, and I think it's best to just show a quick example of this, is the Bootstrap API for JMS or Jakarta messaging. Yet another thing is that JMS, although it's such a successful standard, actually has never really considered interoperability in the sense that JMS clients and servers actually only talk to each other if they're provided from the same vendor. Similarly, you can't actually communicate with JMS outside of Java because the protocol layer has never been standardized and there hasn't never been a sense of interoperability. But it's a known problem that actually has been solved. So AMQP has solved this problem. MQTT has solved this problem. There's other messaging standards that have solved this problem. So what remains actually is for the JMS specification itself, for the Jakarta messaging specification itself, to adopt those interoperability standards, and it's doable. You can do it. Again, if you talk about messaging light, that could potentially be MQTT compatible. Right? MQTT is a subset of what AMQP generally provides, and Jakarta messaging itself can be very easily translated into accepting and working with AMQP bindings. So I'll show you an quick example of the message listener API. You can see, so you can kind of sort of do this in message event beans, this sort of thing. The code example that I have here, the semantics is very ugly and very vendor specific. So if we take a modern look at this, this is how it could look like. We could apply things like, for example, max concurrency to do concurrency throttling of messaging, message handling from a declarative message consumer. We could get rid of all of the like a message translation of looking into the message body. All of that could be done automatically, just like you see in this particular code example. We could be doing things like filtering using selectors in a declarative way, handling headers in a declarative way. We could be consuming messages in a more opinionated way, let's say by in batches or ordering by something like a timestamp, standardizing the concept of retries, retry delays, dead letter queues, all of these things that today actually are proprietary. They're not actually standardized, but they're commonly understood. They're commonly implemented across JMS providers, but they're not actually standardized. And we could finally take the opportunity to actually standardize these things as part of a modern view of how a message consumer inside of Jakarta EE should look like. Again, in a completely CDI way, and not coupled in any not coupled with EJB, not its own thing, but simply just a CDI service that you consume at will. Similarly, another long-standing thing that's sort of possible today, and but not standardized, is being able to spin up JMS containers outside of a Jakarta EE container altogether. You might want to do this. You might want to do this if you're not running in a Jakarta EE container, but you want to use Jakarta messaging. You might want to do this for things like unit and integration testing. You might want to do this if you're just interested in creating a Java SE client or Java SE-like client somewhere. Very easy semantics, right? We kind of know how the semantics should look like, and here's an example of that. So it's a very small bits of a few APIs that you need to add in order to make this reality. Again, we've been talking about this since the JMS2, Java E7 days, but hasn't happened, right? Yet another thing that could be happening. Security is one of those things that was actually long neglected. A lot of the security features in Java EE were left to the vendors. So as a result, there's this little bit of a backlog with regards to Jakarta security, and certainly with regards to aligning the spec with more modern paradigms like OIDC and JWT and OAuth. Right? So thankfully now there's a concept, at least there's a OIDC capability built into Jakarta security. What isn't is JWT. So now we're actually, if you're aware of what's going on, we're finally talking about sort of merging both the Jakarta EE and microfile standards. You know, microfile has created a solution for JWT some time ago. It doesn't actually talk to Jakarta security at all, which is a very strange situation. I hope that as part of this move with microprofile, we can actually just consider bringing in JWT into Jakarta security in a proper way and standardize it in the way that has always made sense. Same thing with roles allowed. You didn't think that you can only use in certain places like EJB. This shouldn't be the case. This should be, again, a built-in interceptor built into the platform that you can use with any CDI compatible bean. Another interesting concept is EL enabled authorization. So this one. So this again is a known gap in the way the Jakarta EE handles security for some time. So you have these very coarse-grained annotations like roles allowed that says, okay, allow access to this method if you have this certain set of roles. So, but it's a hammer. It's a very coarse-grained thing. In reality, what we observe in the wild is that security or declarative security or authorization in Java applications tend to be a little bit more fine-grained than that. Now, of course, you can solve this by creating just a CDI interceptor yourself and consuming the currently logged in user, look at their current authorizations, and do what you need to do. But guess what? We also have this nice underutilized facility inside of Jakarta EE called EL, expression language. So you can combine the concept of annotations to give it a declarative spin, but also have some programmatic fine-grained control by allowing the use of EL within those annotations. So you can come up with a powerful paradigm, just like you see in this example here. And this could be realized and make Jakarta Security at the same time simpler to use and as well as very flexible and powerful as well. So yet again, it's a concept that's been sitting there for a while. Yet another concept that's solved in microfile via microfile config. And there's just such a long time that we've been talking about these things. And it's a well understood set of use cases. And my hope again is like, and we from the ambassadors community, we have run surveys and asked people in person again and again, what do you want to see here? And the desire is just so clear. The desire is to move the functionality that's been specified in microfile and make it generally available in Jakarta EE in a proper way, including the namespace, and make sure that Jakarta EE itself is modernized to take advantage of those paradigms. Right. So these are things like externalizing your application configuration, either in property files or YAML these days, even using or either that or system properties, environment variables, some combination thereof, as well as being able to externalize it further. So, for example, if those are not good enough, you could potentially read the Java configuration properties from Kubernetes secrets, from secure cloud storage. For those of you who have been on the cloud, there's things like Azure Key Vault. Google and Amazon have their own analogs of that. Being able to store configuration there outside of your application in a distributed way, or even in simple NoSQL stores, like, for example, Redis, right? For example, in Azure Redis. And we, guess what? I mean, things, the people like the .NET folks have been doing this for forever and a day. Or even in relational databases, if you so wish, this should be possible. It is kind of sort of possible in microfile today. Could be significantly improved by moving that functionality into Jakarta EE and properly standardizing it. Now, in the end, when you do that, here are the capabilities that it unlocks for you. Being able to inject configuration into your code, being able to look up configuration dynamically in the code where inject is not sufficient, being able to reference configuration in EL, just like in my prior example, I'll show you another one in a moment, being able to reference it in XML, or not configuring XML whatsoever and just defining your configuration in terms of property file. It's so sad to see that we actually originated this idea back in EE7. And guess what happened? Like as has happened so many times, Spring implemented this idea while we were talking about it. We just talked about it and said, oh, this is a problem we need to solve. And Spring guys, they didn't just talk about it, they just went ahead and implemented it. And it's time we fixed it, right? We fixed it in a proper way. So here's some examples of, when we do this, this is the kind of things we ought to be able to do. So you ought to be able to inject a configuration value. You ought to give it a default value if you want. You can even apply bean. You should be able to apply things like bean validation annotations to it. You could, again, maybe get rid of things like the persistence.xml and just define these values in a centralized YAML file or a centralized properties file. When you are using XML or you're using Java configuration, you ought to be able to reference configuration values, just like I have, just as if you will, like something like an environment variable, right? And again, being able to mix and match these internal baked-in configuration with external parts of it that's externalized configuration outside of your application. NoSQL is an important one. I am personally on the fence whether NoSQL should really be standardized in Jakarta EE. I think it belongs sort of more in a place that is not quite a standard. So I think actually the place where it is today is probably the best place for it. But it's a matter of opinion what you want to do. Right now, it is a standalone specification. It was just finalized. It's basically an effort to standardized NoSQL access from Java and Jakarta EE applications, just like you can in JPA with relational databases, for example. Actually, the API looks very similar to JPA in some ways. Does this in a very clever and sensible way, and a novel way, actually. So it's not just sort of one size fits all. There's actually the API. When you look at it, it's actually broken down by taxonomy. So there's slightly different parts of the API that caters to key value pairs versus column families versus document databases versus graph databases. And it also integrates with other parts of the Jakarta standards. So things like the repository spec that was just created, mean validation, as well as hopefully externalized configuration. Here's a quick example of that. I won't go into it too much. It should look terribly familiar, but this is an example of how the Jakarta NoSQL spec looks like today. You can use it today. I think it's correct that it is standalone. So you add it to your applications yourself, as opposed to sort of being part of the runtime by default. MVC is another one. This used to be a very important debate some time ago. In the EE7 timeframe in particular, where we are talking about whether or not JSF is sufficient, or whether we should add yet another option for server-side Java-based templating that is more along the lines of more rudimentary or more basic MVC pattern, similar to if you were in the Spring land, Spring MVC, similar to that, similar to struts and so on. They never really adopted the full-scale MVC model like JSF has, component-based model that JSF has. And it does, right? We ought to have had a option like this, and there was one. The intent was actually to create this as part of Java E8, and again, it's a standalone spec. I think there was a point in time where it may have made sense to add this into the platform. I don't think it does anymore. In fact, I even believe there's a reasonable debate to be had whether even JSF really belongs in the platform anymore, or whether it should actually be made as a standalone spec as well. But it exists now, right? It has been mature for a little while, and again, I think it's in a reasonable place right now, right? You can, if you need it, you just add it yourself. You add Jakarta MVC, and it is basically actually just reusing a few things from the platform. It's using CDI, it's using bean validation, it is using some parts of Jakarta REST. So it totally makes sense actually. So here's a quick example of it. So here's how a controller looks like in Jakarta MVC today. Right, this is a real code you could deploy and it will work. And you can see it basically reuses most of the JAX-RS and CDI annotations. So get controller, get path, all of these things are already defined in Jakarta REST. You have the CDI parts of it, bean validation parts of it. There's a small amount of annotations that you need to add. So one is controller and the other one is view. And the view, all it really does is that it takes your HTTP handler and it binds it to a visualization, some markup that depicts your UI, right? In this case, it can use XHTML, but actually there's other view technologies that Jakarta MVC supports as well in a pluggable fashion. There are many other things, right? So these are just sort of the main topics of large grain things that make sense for per spec. But there's a bunch of other things. So we already talked about adding record support for JSON binding. I hope this is going to happen sooner rather than later. Today, actually, you can easily do startup stuff in EJB just by adding a startup annotation. You can't really do that in CDI so easily. You can do it, but good luck figuring out the syntax. It's a very sort of at observes. I can't even remember it off the top of my head. It's at observe some startup event, right, as opposed to just a startup annotation. So I hope there's going to be a single annotation like that added in CDI. We've discussed this with the CDI specification, the value proposition of why we want to do this. Today, if you're using Jakarta Batch, you're stuck using XML. No need for that, right? You could be defining Java job definitions in Java itself, as opposed to defining it in XML. Once we're ready for it, we could be replacing the most popular EJB annotation, and that is stateless session. At stateless, with something that actually makes more sense and is more modern, and even perhaps is more modernly named, like at service stereotype built into the platform. Again, if we decide to bring in configuration, this becomes a no-brainer. But it's a no-brainer even now. Sometimes it's like when you add this persistence.xml file, you're like, okay, why am I even adding this? Like this, the platform should know the things that I want and should just be doing it by default, right? So again, making persistence.xml perhaps an optional or empty marker. A Bootstrap API for Jakarta EE, again, a long-standing pain point. There's no reason we couldn't do that. We could do that quite easily. I'll show you an example of it. So here's an example of what Yason actually implements today, but isn't in the spec. It's only working by accident. So this is a very common use case, right? So when you have a JAX-RS endpoint and you want to publish a JSON object, that JSON object doesn't need to be a POJO anymore. That can be a record, just like in the example here. This is not specified currently, so this shouldn't be working. Technically, if you do this, you should be getting an exception, and that's rather weird. Why wouldn't this work? So I hope this is going to be resolved soon. Here's an example of instead of defining the job definition XML, how it could look like in Java. This is an example of when we are ready to replace CJB and we want to come up with a replacement to the stateless annotation. This is how it could look like. It could be a built-in stereotype that basically provides a one-to-one analog, more or less, of the things that actually made sense in stateless, and maybe add a few other things that are more modern and make sense in today's world. For example, perhaps publishing your metrics automatically, your bean metrics automatically. So things like that could be a built-in CDI stereotype in the platform. This is how a Bootstrap API for Jakarta EE looks like. This day and age, we shouldn't be. There's no reason why we ought to be able to do this. A lot of the, if not all, of the modern Jakarta EE runtimes, whether it's Wildfly or Payara or Open Liberty, they can all start in Java SE. They don't need to. You don't. We're not stuck anymore in the world where we have to absolutely have a container installed and running, and then we absolutely need to manually deploy or programmatically deploy a year or WAR file. Most of the containers have already made it possible to just do all of that at runtime. So it's just such a small step, one more step that says, okay, we ought to be able to have some kind of API that you can invoke statically from, let's say, public static void main that will just start the container for you and just do the deployment for you. So this is also very possible. I think it's very doable. Even in something like Glassfish embedded, you could easily do this. Okay. So if you don't do any of these things, there's still plenty of work for you plenty of other ways that you can contribute towards Jakarta E12. These are things like, it would be very useful to have websites, specific websites for all of these technologies. It's better branding, it's better marketing. So some specs have it, CDI has it, Bean Validation has it, JSF used to at one point in time have its own website. You could be helping create these websites. You could be helping with the Jakarta examples. It's sort of a long neglected part of the overall E4J project. Actually, it could use revitalization. Thankfully, it used to be true of the official Jakarta tutorial. Thankfully, it's not anymore, thanks to folks like Keto. Now we actually do have an updated Jakarta tutorial, but that could always use help. The starter, again, there didn't used to be one for many years. I think the starter is in decent enough shape now, but there are some things. If you look at the Jakarta starter site, we've actually marked a few things that are like sort of help wanted or good first issue, so you could look there if you wanted to contribute. Similar for Cargo Tracker, it's in a decent shape now, but yeah, there's always help we can have. And again, if you look at the issue tracker for Cargo Tracker, there's issues marked good first issue or help wanted, so you can take a look at that, and yet another way for you to contribute. But if let's say you don't need to, you're not ready to do any of that just yet, or you are, and how do you get started? Well, here's the basic one slide of how to do that. First and foremost, to be aware of what's going on, and that's not necessarily that easy. You do need to do some work on your part to do that. So you need to go and look the mailing list, subscribe yourself there. You need to go look at each of the Jakarta EE things are on Git, or they're all on GitHub. You can go and subscribe there and follow those in the normal GitHub way. When you're ready to contribute something, if you just want to contribute an opinion, well, you can do that in GitHub or just on the mailing list. If you want to do something beyond that and you actually want to contribute something, well, guess what? You can do that as well, right? So, and it's very simple. The basic contribution is like any other open source project. You sign an agreement. In this case, it's called the ECA. It's literally one-page form, and like the most important part is like your signature, basically, and then that's all. And you're ready to contribute to anything Jakarta EE. If you want to become a committer, that requires a little bit more work. But most people, I don't think, are going to be committers. I think that's a very small case, edge case. There's a bit more than signing the ACI if you want to do that. Happy to talk to you offhand. And if you need help on any of this, there's people that can help you, namely the ambassadors, the people that have been doing this for some time, even going back to the JCP era. So these are the folks that can show you around, tell you what is a productive and useful way of contributing, how you go about doing it. So in summary, E11 is almost here. It has some important set of changes. Primary reason one of the primary reasons we did all of this Jakarta EE business is to make sure that it is actually more vendor neutral and more people can contribute. So I guess this is your call to action from this talk. I hope you saw enough that inspired you to be more engaged in one way or the other. If you do that, you need to do that now. Think about how what interests you, what are your capabilities, how is it that you can help contribute, and ask for help if you need to. And then finally, I'll leave you with a set of resources here. There's a tiny bit of time for Q&A, so let me wrap up here. And before we all sort of go away, now I'm going to do two things. I'm going to put in the Jakarta EE Ambassadors Contributor Guide link, so you can take a look at that offline. And I'm also going to share a link to the presentation today. And I'm also going to share my contact information. So now after that, we can do a tiny bit of Q&A. I haven't seen not one question, so I don't know what that means. I hope it doesn't mean
We
something bad, but what can I do?
No, not at all, Reza. You have a question, but thank you so much for that great presentation. First and foremost, there. But we do have one question from Jan Nilsson, and I'll put it up on the screen right here. And it says Swing is still a part of Java. The default communication protocol between Swing and application server is Corba, and then in parentheses RMI slash IIOP. Corba is deprecated and removed. Can you explain on this?
Oh man, this is wrong on so many levels. I'm sorry, folks. You need to update your knowledge, especially before you make these kind of definitive statements. Swing is barely part of Java anymore. It's JavaFX, by the way, is absolutely not. It's actually been removed. And Swing, AWT, and JavaFX are all but dead parts of the standard, right? They're officially by the OpenJDK project. These things have been put in maintenance mode. So folks, you need to figure out if you're still using Swing and you're still using AWT, you're still using JavaFX, you really need to figure out what to do. If need be, you need to go and talk to the OpenJDK project and say, folks, this stuff is not dead yet, or we don't want it to be dead. Where you'll be fighting a pretty strong uphill battle because there's no demand for it. People are not developing UI applications in Java SE anymore. So and maybe there is a space for it still, right? With all this agentic stuff coming in, maybe there is a place for these things, but it is not today. You are on the edge of a very steep cliff if you're still using any of these things. That's number one. Number two, you do not need EJB remoting whatsoever to talk to the server side from something like Swing, AWT, or Java FX. In fact, you would be highly discouraged to use such an outdated thing. So you should be looking into how you communicate to your backend using something more modern and relevant today and more widely used, like either probably start with REST, Jakarta REST. See how you communicate with your Java SE client using a modern protocol like JAX-RS, or even something like WebSocket. Why on earth do you want to still be stuck with something as ancient and outdated and clunky as Corba? Come on, folks.
Thank you for answering that question. If there is no other questions in the chat or in the Ask a Questions tab. So again, Reza, thank you so much for your time, for your contribution. We greatly appreciate it, and I know that the community does as well. So we look forward to having you again and again and again. You have yourselves all a wonderful rest of your day. And if there's anything, please feel free to put your notes in the chat, and Reza is more than happy to answer anything further. He did share his contact information. Thank you
Okay, yeah,
again.
I'm happy to talk with anyone offline, right? I mean, I know like people are running old stuff and outdated stuff, but like, I mean, honestly, like, is this what you want to be doing in 2025 when we're talking about agentic AI and generative AI? But thank you for having me. I really truly do appreciate your time, and yeah, hope to see you in the future.
See you very soon, Reza. Take care.